The tall wooden doors of Courtroom 302 felt heavy as the teenage boy pushed them open. The smell hit him first: old books, wood polish, and nerves. His palms were sweaty. His heart raced. He was just a 17-year-old high school kid walking into a world of adults with fancy words and serious faces. The boy stood at the back of the packed courtroom, watching. His hands shook a little as he waited. He hadn't slept much the night before. How could he? Today was the day he'd been planning for weeks. All around him, the courthouse buzzed with its everyday noise. Lawyers in dark suits whispered to each other. The court clerk's fingers clicked away at her keyboard. And up front, sitting high above everyone else, was Judge Reynolds. Her face looked tired but strict, like a teacher who'd been dealing with troublemakers all day. The boy's mom sat beside him, dabbing her eyes with a crumpled tissue. She had no idea what her son was about to do. Nobody did. It's been 3 years, he thought to himself. 3 years since he'd watched his dad being led away in handcuffs from this very room. 3 years of empty chairs at dinner tables. 3 birthdays with no dad to blow out candles with. A middle school graduation where he'd scanned the crowd, hoping for a miracle that never came. The clerk called his name for the victim impact statement. His mom looked confused. This wasn't what they had come for. But the boy stood up straight, took a deep breath, and walked forward. His sneakers squeaked against the polished floor, making heads turn. Judge Reynolds didn't even look up from her papers. To her, this was just another case, another statement, another ordinary day. The boy gripped the edges of the wooden podium. The microphone stood tall in front of him. He leaned in close. "Your Honor," he said, and was surprised at how steady his voice sounded. 3 years ago, you took my father away." The room went dead quiet. You could have heard a pin drop. Judge Reynolds' hand froze in midair, her gavel suspended like time itself had stopped. She finally looked up, really looked, at the young face staring back at her. Her eyes narrowed slightly, like she was trying to place him in her memory. "You don't remember me," the boy continued, his voice echoing in the silent room. "But I remember everything about that day. I was 14 when you sentenced my dad to 15 years for a non-violent offense. 15 years for selling some pills. That's more than my whole life up to that point." People started to whisper. A court officer stepped forward, unsure if he should intervene. The judge held up her hand, signaling him to wait. "I'm not here to say my dad did nothing wrong," the boy said. "He broke the law. I know that." He paused, swallowing hard. "But I'm here because I want you to see what else happened when you banged that gavel. I want you to know about the other sentence, the one my family's been serving right alongside him." The judge's face changed. Something flickered behind her eyes, recognition maybe. Or perhaps something deeper. "When you sentenced my dad," the boy said, his voice growing stronger with each word, "you were also sentencing me. You were sentencing my little sister who still asks when daddy's coming home. You were sentencing my mom who works 3 jobs now and falls asleep crying most nights." A tear slid down his cheek, but he didn't wipe it away. He stood tall, shoulders back, eyes locked with the judge who held his father's fate in her hands. "I'm not just another sad story standing at this podium," he said. "I'm the other side of justice that nobody in this room ever talks about." The courtroom stayed quiet. Even the usual whispers had stopped. The boy took a deep breath and continued. "The day after you sentenced my dad, I had to explain to my 8-year-old sister why her daddy wouldn't be at her dance recital that weekend, or any weekend for the next 15 years. His voice caught a little, but he pushed through. "Try explaining prison to a kid who still believes in tooth fairies." He gripped the podium tighter. "My mom works 3 jobs now. She cleans office buildings at night, works at the grocery store during the day, and does delivery driving on weekends. I barely see her anymore. When she comes home, her hands are cracked and bleeding from cleaning chemicals. Sometimes I find her asleep at the kitchen table, still in her work uniform." A woman in the jury box wiped her eyes. One of the court officers stared at his shoes. "I had to grow up fast," the boy continued. "I learned to cook because somebody had to feed my sister. I quit the basketball team even though the coach said I had potential. There wasn't time for that anymore. Somebody had to be there when my sister got home from school." The boy wasn't shouting. He wasn't crying either. Something about his calm telling made his story hit even harder. Last year, our electricity got shut off in January. 3 days in the dark and cold before Mom could get enough money together. My sister and I slept in the same bed under all the blankets we owned. I told her we were having an indoor camping adventure. The judge's face had changed. She wasn't looking stern anymore. She looked human. My dad made mistakes, the boy said, surprising everyone with the fairness in his voice. I know what he did was wrong, but the punishment didn't stop with him. It came home with us. He looked directly at the prosecutor, whose eyes darted away. Last month, a college scout came to watch me play in the city championship. I wasn't there. I was working my weekend job stocking shelves. My teacher told me later the scout had a scholarship offer. But opportunities don't wait for kids like me. The defense attorney leaned forward in his chair, forgetting to take notes. He'd heard hundreds of statements in this courtroom, but never one like this. Maybe this is just how the system works, the boy said. Maybe nobody is supposed to think about what happens to us, the families left behind. We're just side effects, I guess. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle across the courtroom. There are thousands of kids like me out there. Thousands of moms working themselves to death. Thousands of little sisters having nightmares about their daddies locked in cages. We didn't do anything wrong, but we're doing time too. The boy looked up at the judge. His eyes weren't angry. That's what got to her the most. They were just tired, like he'd been carrying something heavy for a very long time. I just want to ask you something, Your Honor. When you hand down these long sentences, do you ever picture the kitchen tables with empty chairs? Do you ever think about the birthday candles being blown out with nobody there to see? Do you ever wonder about us? The prosecutor's pen dropped to the floor with a crack that echoed through the silent room. Nobody moved to pick it up. The boy returned to his seat beside his mother, who squeezed his hand so tight it almost hurt. The courtroom slowly came back to life, shuffling papers, clearing throats, whispered conversations. But something had changed in the air. Judge Reynolds sat very still, looking at the space where the boy had stood. For the first time in her 15-year career, she didn't know what to say. She called a short recess, her voice lacking its usual firmness. Later that afternoon, when the final case had been heard and the courtroom emptied, the judge remained at her bench. The cleaning lady came in, then backed out quietly when she saw the judge still sitting there, staring at nothing. Finally alone, Judge Reynolds opened the drawer where she kept her personal items. She pulled out a small frame holding a photo of her own 2 children, both grown now, both thriving. She touched their faces through the glass. "What have I been doing all these years?" she whispered to the empty room. That evening, instead of driving straight home to her quiet neighborhood with its tidy lawns and 2-car garages, Judge Reynolds did something she'd never done before. She stayed late at the courthouse, pulling file after file from the records room. The security guard poked his head in around midnight. "Everything okay, Judge?" She looked up, glasses perched on her nose, surrounded by stacks of folders. "I'm not sure," she answered honestly. When the cleaning lady came back around 2 a.m., she found the judge asleep at her desk, her cheek resting on a file labeled with the name of the boy's father. The next morning, with dark circles under her eyes, Judge Reynolds called her clerk. "Get me everything we have on alternative sentencing for non-violent offenders, and find me the latest research on the impact of incarceration on families." The clerk raised his eyebrows but knew better than to ask questions. For the next week, the judge arrived earlier and stayed later than anyone else in the courthouse. People noticed the change. The usual sharp tap of her heels was slower, more thoughtful. Her rulings became longer, more detailed, as if she was weighing something new in each case. In her little office behind the courtroom, piles of research papers grew taller each day. Reports with titles like "Children of Incarcerated Parents," "The Hidden Costs of Prison," and "Family Stability and Recidivism Rates" covered every surface. She'd found statistics that made her stomach tight. Children with a parent in prison were 3 times more likely to drop out of school, 7 times more likely to end up in prison themselves someday. The cycle spinning round and round, trapping generation after generation. At night, she couldn't sleep. The boy's tired eyes followed her into her dreams. "Do you ever think about us?" he'd asked. The truth was, she hadn't. Not really. Not beyond some vague notion that punishment should fit the crime. But what if the punishment stretched far beyond the person who committed the crime? What if it wrapped around innocent children like a chain? On the seventh day after the boy's testimony, Judge Reynolds sat in her garden watching the sunset. Her husband brought her a cup of tea and sat beside her. "You're different lately," he said gently. "What's happening?" She took a long time to answer. "I think I've been getting it wrong," she finally said. "For years now. I've been looking at cases, not people. I've been following guidelines without questioning if they make sense." Her husband took her hand. He'd never heard her talk this way in all their years together. "There was this boy," she started, and then the whole story spilled out. How one teenager with nothing but honesty and courage had made her question everything about a system she'd been part of for 15 years. "So what are you going to do?" her husband asked when she finished. Judge Reynolds looked out at her perfect garden, thinking of all the children growing up without fathers or mothers because of decisions she'd made. "I'm going to fix it," she said simply, "starting tomorrow." 2 weeks passed. The boy had gone back to his life. School in the morning, work in the afternoon, helping his sister with homework at night. He hadn't expected anything to change because of what he'd said that day in court. What was one teenager's voice against a system that big? He was surprised when the official-looking letter arrived. His mom handed it to him at breakfast, her face worried. "It's from the courthouse," she said quietly. The boy's hands trembled as he tore open the envelope. Inside was a letter on heavy paper with a courthouse seal at the top. "They want me to come in," he said, scanning the words. "Judge Reynolds wants to meet with me." His mom's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. "Aren't you in trouble?" He read the letter again. "I don't think so. It says it's about discussing initiatives related to my statement, whatever that means." 2 days later, the boy found himself sitting in a small meeting room near the courtroom. No podium this time, no audience, just a simple wooden table and some chairs. When Judge Reynolds walked in, she wasn't wearing her black robe. She had on a regular blue blazer and pants. Without the robe, she looked smaller somehow, more human. "Thank you for coming," she said, sitting across from him. Gone was the stern voice that had sentenced his father. She sounded tired, like someone who hadn't slept well in a while. "Am I in trouble?" the boy asked before he could stop himself. To his surprise, the judge smiled a little. "No, the opposite, actually." She folded her hands on the table. "What you said that day, it's changed how I think about my job." The boy sat up straighter. "I've been a judge for 15 years, she continued. "I've sentenced thousands of people. I always thought I was serving justice." She paused, looking down at her hands. "But I've been thinking a lot about what justice really means, and who pays the price when we get it wrong." The judge explained that she'd spent the past 2 weeks studying the effects of long sentences on families. She'd talked to experts and read studies. Most importantly, she'd started making changes. "I've launched a new requirement in my courtroom," she told him. "Before sentencing, I now require a full family impact assessment. We look at how many children are involved, what support systems exist, what the real-world consequences will be." The boy listened, afraid to hope, but feeling something warm growing in his chest. "I've also started a program for kids to have regular video calls with their parents in prison. It's not the same as having them home, but it's something." The judge took a deep breath. "And most importantly, I'm working with the district attorney to review cases of non-violent offenders who received sentences that might have been excessive." The boy's heart started to pound. "My dad?" Judge Reynolds nodded. "Your father's case is being reviewed right now." "I can't promise anything," she added quickly. "But we're looking at options like work release or supervised probation for the remainder of his sentence." The boy gripped the edge of the table, feeling dizzy. Could this really be happening? "Why are you doing this?" he asked. The judge looked him straight in the eyes. "Because you made me see the people behind the files. You made me understand that when I sentence someone, I'm not just changing one life. I'm changing many." She slid a folder across the table. "This is a record of the changes we're implementing. I want you to have it. What you did took courage, real courage." The boy stared at the folder, unable to find words. "There's something else," the judge said. "I've started a youth advisory council for the court system. We need voices like yours, people who have lived with the consequences of these decisions. Would you consider joining us?" For the first time in 3 years, the boy felt something new bloom inside him. Not just hope, but something bigger. The feeling that maybe one voice really could make a difference. That maybe the system wasn't set in stone after all. 10 years had passed since that day in the courtroom. What had started as one boy's brave stand had grown into something much bigger than anyone could have imagined. The young man now stood on the steps of the state capitol building, surrounded by reporters and cameras. Behind him stood dozens of families, children, parents, grandparents, all wearing blue shirts with the words, "Family Justice Now," printed across the front. "Today marks a historic moment," he said into the cluster of microphones. "The Family Impact Bill has officially passed." The crowd erupted in cheers. Some people hugged. Others wiped away tears. This new law required judges across the state to consider the impact on families before sentencing anyone for non-violent offenses. It created funding for support programs for children with incarcerated parents, and it established a review process for cases where long sentences might have caused undue hardship on families. His father stood at the edge of the crowd, gray now sprinkled through his hair. He wore a suit that fit him properly these days. 10 years free. 10 years of rebuilding. Of being there for soccer games and science fairs and Sunday dinners. As the crowd began to disperse, a reporter approached the young man. "This all started with you as a teenager, confronting a judge," she said, holding out her recorder. "Did you ever imagine it would lead to this?" The young man looked around at the families heading home, families that would stay together because of what had happened here today. "No," he answered honestly. "I just wanted to be heard. I just wanted someone to know what it felt like for us kids left behind." The reporter nodded. "Your story has inspired similar legislation in 12 other states now. What would you say to kids out there who feel powerless to change the system?" The young man thought about this. "I tell them that speaking up matters, even when it feels like nobody's listening. Change doesn't always happen overnight. Sometimes it takes years. But your voice matters." Later that evening, his family gathered for dinner at his parents' house. His sister was home from law school for the weekend. His mother had finally retired from her cleaning business. His father had just been appointed to a state commission on criminal justice reform. As they passed dishes around the table, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from Judge Reynolds, now in her 70s and retired, but still mentoring young judges. "Watching the news. So proud of what you've accomplished. Never stop speaking truth." The young man smiled and put his phone away. He looked around the table at his family, whole and healing and happy. He thought about all the other families who would now have a chance at the same. One voice, one courtroom, one moment of truth. Sometimes that's all it takes to start a wave that keeps rolling, growing stronger, changing everything in its path.